the May meeting of the Georgetown-Scott County Planning Commission. First item of business is approval of April invoices. I'm sure y'all have looked over it by now. I have a motion to approve the April invoices.
So moved.
I'll second.
We have a motion to approve in a second.
Oh,
Do you want, looking for a vote for approval? Say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay, approval of the April 23rd, or April 13th minutes.
I
Your
move.
motion?
I move that we accept the minutes as the way they were written. Second.
Motion by Mr. Stone, and second by Mr. Shirley. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? And we have the May agenda. Any changes to it, Joe?
No changes, but I don't know if you wanted to add a discussion of the 8-5 zone district on there, the discussion we had at workshop.
Okay, yes, we
We
would do
could add
that.
that on there, because we're not going to take action.
Right.
What do you
So
call it?
item B,
Discuss the A5 zoning district.
Okay. So approval of the, of this month's agenda, to have a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Mr. Vest. All in favor say aye. Any opposition? All right,
Discussion.
no other items other than what's
5
listed for
minutes
postponement
late,
or
I didn't
withdrawal.
hear any.
no, sir, we did have, the Big Pine Land Company was withdrawn
Ah.
after last month, because they had met their 3 postponements.
Right.
And they're going to resubmit with a new application, but we didn't put it on here.
Okay,
But you may want to announce that, Big Pine Land number pipe has been withdrawn.
okay. Was anyone here for Big Pine Land Development on Burton Pike? Okay. So we have one item for consent agenda.
5-acre tract.
Is that correct?
32.
Okay. So before we, 2,
Yeah, item C and item D.
C and D, okay.
That's great.
Good. All right, before we get started then, Mr. Perkins, would you swear everyone in?
Everyone sign in and speak. You can stand, raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm the statement you're to make tonight to be the truth to the best of your information and belief? I do. Thank you.
Okay. So, under old business, we have both the Marston property and Redwood Apartments. Both of those have been postponed. So if you're here for either of those, we'll not hear those this month. Okay? So moving on down to the first item under new business, FSP 2023-12, Sam's property, final subdivision plat to subdivide 1 5-acre partial from a farm measuring 54 acres located on Indian Creek Road. And because there are no waivers or anything that is eligible for consent, is there anyone here that is opposed to that development or would like to hear it? All right, so that is eligible for consent, and all I need is a motion and a second. Mr. Jesse,
I'll second.
second by Ms. Singer. All right, Ms. Singer,
Aye.
Mr. Shirley,
Yes.
Mr. Jesse,
Yes.
Mr. Vest,
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Yes.
I should have made the, let everyone know that Mr. Garrett and Mr. Smith are not here tonight for the record. So Mr. Green?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. So, Ms. Sams, if you'll come up here and see Mr. Perkins sign some papers, you will be done and out of here. The next item on the agenda is Popeye's Restaurant, PDP 2023-13. It's a preliminary development plan for 3.045 square foot fast food restaurant located at 100 Darby Drive. And again, they are not asking for any variances, and so it is eligible for consent. Is there anyone in the audience that has questions about that property or opposed to it? All right, I'll take a motion and a second.
A motion for the approval of PDP 2023-13.
I'll second. And second by Mr. Vest. All right. Mr. Green?
Yes.
Mr. Stone?
Yes.
Mr. Vest?
Yes.
Mr. Jesse?
Yes.
Mr. Shirley?
Yes.
Ms. Singer?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. All right. The next item is,
Excuse me,
yeah.
we have an applicant come up here and sign the condition.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, good, okay. I just saw someone leave and I didn't want that to be the person.
Be them, huh?
Excellent.
Getting ahead of myself, sorry.
Did you sign the marriage?
Do what?
Did
For last month, yes.
you sign them?
I signed it, gave it to them. I assumed
It was before.
Okay, the next item is ZMA 2023-14, 112 West Penn, BGAR Properties. This is a zoning map amendment to change the zoning district from R2 to B1, located on the south side of West Penn, west of Broadway.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. This, like, as you said, this is a request to change the zone on a piece of property on West Penn, which gets us access from North Broadway, just north of downtown. So this is a little less than a half-acre lot that's currently zoned R2, medium-density residential. It has had a building on the lot for at least 50 years, I believe. So it's kind of it's a green industrial / commercial building / barn that's been on the property for a long time. It's adjacent to another lawfully non-conforming commercial building on 110 Penn, and they were owned by the same person for a number of years. This one has been vacant, for at least 10 years. I think it was used to store materials in for 112 for a while as well. But the applicant's requesting to rezone to B1 neighborhood commercial, and initially their request was for B2 highway commercial. We met with them and discussed the use that they're proposing, and we recommended B1. So they amended their application from B2 highway commercial to B1 neighborhood commercial. And neighborhood commercial is more office service uses, no drive-throughs, no heavy truck or vehicle usage, no used car lots. Because this lot, is on a dead-end street, sets off Broadway. We thought B1 would be a more appropriate kind of transition from the highway commercial along Broadway and the residential to the south. So they have submitted a concept plan and a justification for their zone change. Oops, I'm going backwards. Let me review just kind of the details of the site first. So this is the property. It's kind of an odd-shaped parcel that's bounded by floodplain to the west. The floodplain kind of touches the western edge of the lots, but it doesn't really go onto the lot. So most of the area, minus maybe a couple feet at the very point of the property, is out of the floodplain. It does slope from east to west towards Royal Spring Creek that feeds to Cardome from Royal Spring. But you could see the building. The building is built almost to the property line on the east side. This is a view looking west. You can see West Penn is fairly narrow street, but it is paved. It's roughly 20 feet wide, no curb, with some shoulders. But it served as access to the mill, you can see on the right there. And then these two commercial buildings, and then there's there's a residence on the corner of North Broadway, and then there's another residence next to it, and then there's a residence at the end of the street, kind of in the northwest kind of end of the street there.
Two of those residences are the white rectangle right in the middle on the bottom of the screen, and the other one is in the upper right-hand corner, the dark-looking spot up there.
Correct, yeah. This probably might show it a little better, although, yeah, it does. So the two residents on the left, one of them you couldn't see in the other photo, and then the upper right is also a residence. The rest are two industrial buildings and then the mill on the right. So currently the property is actually zone B2 highway commercial on the right-hand side of the street. So West Penn from Broadway to the dead end is kind of the dividing line for the zone. So currently it's B2 highway commercial on the right-hand side and R2 residential on the left. And then along Broadway, it continues the highway commercial.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Just so I understand, where is the floodplain on that picture you had up there? Can you kind of take your point?
Well, if you just followed that diangular line of the lot, that red line that's at a diagonal, it follows that essentially and then continues to the left and to the right. So it.
But all that land is in the floodplain that's beyond that red line?
Well, it kind of cuts back, so it kind of continues it like that and then it goes that way.
All right,
But it follows, along this lot, it kind of follows that red line.
thank you.
Yeah, so they've submitted a concept plan. You can kind of see a fate outline of the existing building. So this is the existing building here that they're going to tear down. They're proposing to tear down. They're going to build a new building in this location, and then a parking lot to the east side, and then a turnaround on the north side of the lot. You can kind of see West Penn. It dead ends at the end. There's no real turnaround at the end, so people who get to the end pull on that woman's lot on the right, and they pull on the mill property to do their turnaround. So just a little bit of history on the area. These two properties were lawfully non-conforming commercial properties, so they've had commercial uses in them, or commercial slash, non-residential intense uses going back probably to the 1950s. There was a Board of Adjustment case on it that determined they could continue to operate as lawfully non-conforming uses. Thought I had the history of the lots there, but I don't. But it documented the history of commercial use in those two buildings going back to the 50s. So they could continue to operate with a limited set of uses that match or are no intense than what has been there in the past. But there was a kind of a consent agreement when it went to Board of Adjustment that there are certain more intense, uses that will not be allowed. So like car sales aren't allowed. You can't use it as a tow yard. Anything that involved a lot of truck traffic is not allowed. But they could continue by requesting the B1. It would make it a conforming or a legal commercial lot, so you could tear down the building then and go back with a commercial lot that would then be legal. In our opinion, tearing down the old building, putting a new kind of building that meets building code, bringing the site up to current standards with stormwater controls, meeting our parking requirements, our paving and landscaping requirements, would be a net improvement for the area and would, allow this to kind of step down from the more intense highway commercial to a commercial use that's less intense and kind of has controlled uses that, you know, there would be some surety on how the properties would be used. And we could then create a buffer based on, you know, applying our landscape and buffer standards, create a buffer between these commercial lots to the residential lot to the south. So we think by actually, you know, what you may consider an upzone to commercial from residential, we think would be a net improvement to the area by cleaning it up, by allowing a new buffer to be put in, by just generally adding some predictability, you know, to the site and some controls to the site. So the findings necessary for a zone change is KRS 102.13 or .213. We've been kind of through this before, but any zone change either has to conform to the comprehensive plan or it has to show that the zoning in place is not appropriate, or there have been changes in the area socially, you know, physically, or of an economic nature that result in this no longer being an appropriate zone in which justify a change in the zone. This is the existing future land use map for the area, and it shows commercial all along North Broadway from downtown. Now we are working on the comprehensive plan update, and we do have a draft future land use map with the update, and we do make modifications to this, but it hasn't been through the whole process and hasn't been adopted yet. But we, you know, as you can see, some of the commercials in the floodplain there crosses the creek. We took all that out of the floodplain. We added I think a quasi-public zone in there, or not zone, but quasi-public area for a potential trail, because there's always been a trail planned from downtown, from Royal Spring to Cardone. And we did take some of the commercial out south and add residential, and the rest we're going to recommend to go with mixed use, which would allow commercial and would allow some mixed use residential to kind of clean up that corridor, because that corridor has always kind of been, there's no real pedestrian improvements, there's no stormwater improvements in that area. So I think by allowing a mixed use zone would allow some redevelopment in that area. So we are recommending on amending this future land use map, but this is the existing future land use map in place, and I think the requested step down in commercial would be a benefit, as I said earlier. Just some pictures, aerials that a neighbor had provided me by email. This is the end of the street and how they're doing a turnaround on the street. So that's just gravel. That circular area is just gravel on this lot. So the lot that in question, subject property, is that green building on the right. The gravel to the bottom goes to the woman's house that was on the north side. But you can kind of see how they're turning around. So to get to that non-conforming commercial use or auto repair use, they're having to pull onto the mill property or that residential property to back in. So there are some conflicts there, but I think that Board of Adjustment case tried to make the area better by limiting that commercial use. And I think it would be better long-term for that property to be zone B1 as well, and you know, eventually that auto-related use maybe to go away would be ideal. But this is the street looking back towards Broadway. That's the pawn shop at the end, but you can see the width of the road. It is wide enough for two cars to pass easily, but parking on the street does restrict movement, and there are no sidewalks in place right now. This is the back where you can see the green building, but if this is redeveloped, our buffer standards are a 15-foot landscape buffer that can be reduced to 5 with a privacy fence. So they could potentially clean that up, put up a 6-foot privacy fence and landscaping in a 5-foot strip to kind of create a more solid buffer there. So I guess to summarize our comments, the property is shown commercial on the future land use map. The current building is in poor condition, and by allowing it to redevelop, we could upgrade the site, the building, the landscaping, and bring it into conformance with our regulations and allow it to provide a better transition from the highway, commercial, and the mill to the residential. There are issues with the road and the business on the road, parking and you know, the overflow from that auto-related business, but it's not related specifically to the property that we're looking at for the zone change. So it's an existing business at 110 that this applicant has no control over. It's just something that's been there for a long time. We believe the site's not appropriate for highway commercial, but neighborhood commercial would be an appropriate zone and would provide that transition. So our findings are that it meets the findings necessary for KRS 100 based on it complying with the future land use map commercial designation, and by coming into conformance with if they come into conformance with our zoning and site development standards for redevelopment of the site, it will get it off the non-conforming use table and back into conformance. So we are recommending approval with 2 conditions. One, they meet all applicable zoning ordinance and subdivision and development regulation standards, and they submit a preliminary and final development plan for approval by the Planning Commission before constructing anything on the site. And that's all I had.
I just have one question, I think just for other people that might be in the audience. So the next step, they will address the parking plan, correct, in the actual plan?
Yes, next they will have to submit a preliminary development plan, so a more detailed sketch of what they want to do, and bring that back to the Planning Commission for your all's review and approval.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I got ahead of myself. First, they have to go to City Council and get the zone change approved, but if they get that approved, then they'll submit a preliminary development plan.
The slide that showed the circular turnaround area right there. So that turnaround area, is that on their property or on the homeowner's property?
It is, most of it is on their property. I'm not sure where the corner is at the end of the street.
Where the property line is?
Yeah, I'm not sure, yeah, where the line is along the street, so that the gravel half circle is on their property.
Okay.
But at the end of the street, there's some gravel too there.
All right.
So I'm not
I
sure.
guess the owners could point that out when they get up there. And then this map that we've got,
Yeah,
it's got the dotted line on here, which usually is a setback. But they're going over the setback area in several places there.
yeah, they will have to meet our setbacks or get a variance. So they'll either have to reduce the building size or the shape of the building.
Okay.
Or get a variance.
All right. Thank you. Anybody else got questions there?
So what would R2, if they kept it in R2, what would go into R2?
It's medium density residential, so
4 apartments or two? How many dwellings would you
.438
put on
times 43,560. So probably three units.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just think about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Before we go any further, for the record, needs to show that Mr. Garrett is now with us here. Anybody else have questions for Joe or any of the staff?
Well, just, because I was on, at least I think, because I feel like we had a
You're not
number of
on
this.
floor rent.
Ma'am?
You and I both were on there.
Yeah, but I think we had in quick succession, a couple of discussions about this area and Board of Adjustments, one of which being was the question of the intensity of the use of the area, worried about disposal of material and things of
Yeah.
that nature. And I think there was
Handworks,
another one,
body
there was a
shop.
discrepancy about the sewer. I'm just making sure was that the conversations we had?
It
Is
was about that
the one
body
you're alluding
shop.
to? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yep.
And then
Yeah.
that, it was just storage and potentially disposal in the green building at the time, and they were still using it for auto service in the adjoining property, is that correct?
Right, yeah, I believe.
We
And
were
they,
trying to
but
figure out
this,
if they had abandoned 112, is that what that was?
yeah, we're trying to determine whether the non-conforming use could continue. And it had stopped for periods of time in its history, but there was no, I think the finding was there was no intent to abandon the commercial use. It just stopped when they, lost tenants over the years and took a while to release it, but they continued to pay commercial taxes.
Yeah, and then that doesn't follow after ownership changes, which I assume it has, I guess, correct? It potentially will.
Yeah, I believe both these lots have changed, but I think in the agreement after Board of Adjustment, the agreement said it would transfer, the non-conforming use would transfer as long as, and they would have to comply with the agreement in the
To
transfer.
meet the guidelines of continuing non-conforming use,
Yeah.
right?
All right, thank you, Mr. Kane. Do we have, the owners or owner representation would like to make any comments or explanations?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, my name is Harold Sims. I'm proud to represent Mr. Josh Vance and Ross Bowens, the principal members of BGAR Properties LLC, who is the applicant tonight. They have met with the commission, met with the staff, and we did originally file an application for to change this to a B2, and then after meeting with staff and listening to their position on the step down of the intensity of the uses, and to try to accommodate a bit of a buffering uses between the B2 to the south and the R2 to the north. This seemed to be an appropriate use. My clients were on board with it. The type of use that is going to be here, it's a batting facility, sports training facility. It would be, there would be a metal building that would be designed. It will be, have appropriate soundproofing in it for batting cages and that sort of use where people would come in. There may be, sometimes it would be a private coach with an individual. Sometimes it may be a coach with he'll bring a portion of his team down, and they would rent out the space for a while and would come in and out. We would, certainly we would have to build the building. As you've heard, we'll come back before planning and zoning with a preliminary development plan that will have to meet all the subdivision and development regulations for the use as it exists. We understand that there are setbacks, and we would have to take care of looking at water runoff. They have engineers retained that are in the process of doing some of that work now, working with staff to try to go through that. There would be between this property and 110, where you can kind of see in the picture, you can kind of see the line where the green starts and the gravel parking lot begins. There would be a retaining wall there because there's kind of a drop down in grade between 110 and this property. The circular area, most of that circular area you see in the front is on our property. Obviously, they would have to establish with proper surveying where the street ends and where we begin. And then I think part of what their design team is looking at right now is how to accommodate the staff's desire for us to have a turnaround there and putting the necessary amount of parking to meet the square footage requirement of our building. the type of use is one that would be adaptive to the neighborhood. It's not gonna be a kind of use that would be, have a drive-through or have the car factor that parking cars and towing cars or the storage of stored vehicles. This use, those type of uses would not be allowed in a B1 zone. Even if the batting cage went away, there would still have to be a zone that would have somewhat a neighborhood component to it that was designed as service-oriented or neighborhood retail kind of a business that would match the neighborhood zone and wouldn't be able to switch over to a zone that would violate either the consent decree or the criteria for the neighborhood commercial zone. It satisfied KRS 100-213 to meet the requirements for a zone map amendment in that this commercial use is consistent with the 2016 comprehensive plan. It also, when you look at some of the goals and objectives I would pull the North Broadway Corridor Small Area Plan. The types here is a little small. I have to take my glasses off. Some of the goals and objectives were with land use in that North Corridor to promote quality infill design development, to incorporate a mixed-use overlay district and encourage development to provide multiple activities. So this is the kind of a step-down zone that would be appropriate between highway commercial and the residential area, would allow there to be some neighborhood use, and it would protect, and it can be done with the idea of protecting the environmentally sensitive area of the Royal Springs stuff. Just over the hill there is another lot between our property that straddles the creek, and so we are not the property owner that is adjacent to the creek. There's one more property owner that actually has land on our side across the creek to the Deshay, back of a lot in Deshay. But we understand that we would have to control our water as it comes off if we put in a parking lot that has X amount of runoff. Planning staff would make sure that if there's too much runoff, that some means of recovery or retention of that is to put into our development. We will know more about all those, what those facilities look like when the preliminary development plan comes to you for your thorough review and consideration at that time. I think that this is an appropriate use for this property. It satisfies the comprehensive plan. It's consistent with the proposed land use in the comprehensive plan, and I urge you to consider this application favorably. Thank you. I'll open any questions.
I have a question. It's concerning the property owners, why are they having to, I question why they're having to take part of their property to create a turnaround for that whole street. I wonder why some of the adjoining properties on the other side should also be involved in providing, if that's going to be is it going to be a city requirement that turnaround exists at the end of that street? I mean, I'm a little confused as to why these guys have to give up so much of their property for a.
Well, we're not really giving it up. Can I speak?
Yeah, come on up to the floor.
Identify yourself.
My name's Ross Bone with VGAR Properties LLC. We're not really giving it up, it's just part of our parking lot. Like, we're not really giving property to the city, it's just part of our parking lot design so that somebody can pull down the street, and if they're coming to our business, great, they're just gonna pull in a parking spot, but if they're not coming to our business, they went down that street, they need to get out of there, they can just pull in our parking lot, back up, get out. It actually creates less of a burden on the surrounding properties.
But are you going to have to give up potential parking spaces in order to?
No, it's just part of our drive lanes.
Okay, all right.
No, It's just drive lanes that we would have to
Because
add
on the
either way.
picture, it looks like it's a pretty good piece of, okay.
Yeah, I can see how you see that, but yeah, really, you gotta have a way to get down to this lane and down to this lane, and we're even looking at what's potentially shrinking the building so that we can get even more parking, because that's something, something we wanna be sure about, that we have enough parking, because, there's not an availability of street parking. We wanna be totally self-sufficient with our parking
Yeah,
and
I
our turnaround.
I was
And then
just-
if the other citizens and people using that street use our parking lot, that's to be expected. And I would imagine if the properties across the street were developed, that the same requirement would be required of them, that there would be they would be required for an emergency vehicle to be able to turn around on their parking lot.
Okay.
Thank you, John, appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
There has been, the owners of the business at 110 has, some of their usage finds its way onto our property, onto my client's property, and they haven't been using it yet, so they've just kind of been accommodating the overflow parking that they have on their property. But once this gets developed as an in use, the owners over there understand that freedom to take up our parking lot with their overflow is not going to continue.
By overflow, you mean vehicles that they're having queue to
Vehicles
work
that
on?
they're waiting to work on, or whatever. We seem to have 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot in front of our place every day when nobody's there.
No
And
materials or anything like that, only?
And once we get developed and we have, a business going there, and, there'll be appropriate signage to make sure that, we don't continue our parking lot doesn't get taken up with the overflow from 110.
Will you need to, put in a fence or retaining wall or something?
Well, I think we do have a retaining wall planned between us and 110, just because it's more or less just kind of
Because it
a
drops
gradual
down.
hill now, and we'll probably want to take advantage of that space by putting in a clearly marked retaining wall.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sims. Anybody else have any questions for him? Okay, thank you. Do we have anyone from the audience that would like to ask questions or make comments? Yes, sir.
Graphics for the TV, but pretty much I'll get into. Probably gotta have you guys share.
Not a problem.
I don't like driving.
All right, my name's Stephen Wire. I own the property south of the lot, and then I also own the lot to the west of 112, West Penn. And you guys were right about the non-conforming uses, and there's a memorandum. I was the one that filed some of those issues and spoke in front of the Board of Adjustments. One of those. I could afterwards.
We'll give you this one over the
I mean, most of it's the pictures, so let me see the rest of the document. Now, ever since I bought that property, there's been issues with 110 just because of, or with Penn Avenue altogether, just because of how it is. It's got the 2 non-conforming uses on it. The one use was pretty much abandoned and was just sitting vacant. The other one has gone through all sorts of issues. It had a unlicensed paint stripping business in it, and that business, they bragged on their website, they're the largest paint stripping facility in Kentucky. The city did nothing about it, so I made the city aware of that multiple times. They weren't licensed, it had no permits, they were venting their fumes in the backyard, they had hazardous waste in their driveway. Code enforcement went out and looked and said, well, we know they're operating there, but we didn't find anything wrong, so they did nothing about it. And then we got the memorandum of agreement, and that kind of limits the use as far as what they can do. I'm not supposed to have any cars parking on the street. Cars actually aren't supposed to be parked outside for more than 3 days. If they're being worked on, they're not supposed to encroach on other people's property, not supposed to make noise, that type of stuff, trying to keep it neighborhood friendly. And as you saw from some of those pictures, they're actually still parking on other people's property, they're keeping cars, so I mean, they're still not in compliance with the city. And then in one of the graphics that was shown, if you look in the top corner, there's actually an illegal junkyard, just like a block north, that's been established going back to like 2018. They just started parking cars in there. It's zoned B2, which junkyard can only be in an industrial zone lot with a conditional use permit and like a special other permit.
So,
And I've made the
excuse me
city
just a
work.
second. Is that on Penn?
No, that's on North Broadway.
Okay.
It's the backside of Easy Pond.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
different
I've made
owners
the-
than the
I've
body
made the city
shop.
aware of that multiple times, and they're like, we're aware of it, and they do nothing.
Okay,
So-
but that's not on Penn
No.
or this property?
No,
Either one of
but
these, okay.
It gets to my point where, I mean, there's just been nonstop zoning issues and compliance issues around that whole area. And the city's like, we know, and then they do nothing. So that's why I'm here today, just for the zoning thing, trying to get stuff right from the beginning, just so everyone's on the same page and we know what's expected.
Okay.
Have you talked to code enforcement about the junkyard or the
Yeah.
violations of the body shop
Yeah.
recently or when?
I did planning and zoning, and they sent a letter saying you need to be in compliance with all this. I mean, they don't make noise. I mean, they keep the place nice, they're friendly and everything else, but they're parking vehicles everywhere. I mean, that's the nature of the business. I'm not sure how they would operate if they didn't take up extra space. But yeah, I mean, they're just not in compliance with it. So, yeah.
You mentioned, I find it shocking that you're having to deal with this. This is not right. But have you filed any complaints with the state or the federal EPA about this?
No, I haven't taken any of that up to, the EPA with the paint stripping shop that was there. Code enforcement came out, said we didn't see anything wrong. I eventually went to the state environmental protection and talked to them, and they came out and talked to one of the assistants that was working there, and he's like, yeah, here's the strong chemicals, and we pour this in the sewer, and we put this in the trash can. The owner at that point was cited and fined for generating thousands of pounds of hazardous material in his building, storing it in open containers in his parking lot, putting it in the sewer, putting it in the landfill with no permits, no regulations.
It was a different owner that owns the property now though, correct?
Yeah, and that guy was a tenant.
Yeah, and
So,
you're
I
not
mean,
alleging they have any EPA level issues
Right,
at
no,
the body
yeah,
shop, just parking vehicles?
Yeah, one tenant's just parking
Okay.
vehicles everywhere. But I mean, that's what I went through with the first one. The state, the code enforcement went out and he got open containers of hazardous material and said that they didn't see anything wrong. So I mean, the city will say, well, you know, they have to comply with the laws. I mean, that's nice, but from what I've seen in that little area, nothing is in compliance, so.
Well, Mr. Wire, if I may, none of these issues actually pertain to the application we're talking about.
It sort of does as far as use, because 112 West Penn was in that memorandum with the 110.
And that's why we're here speaking about the zone change and the expectations for the property moving forward.
Yes, and I'm not opposed to the zone change, but there are issues I felt that haven't been addressed yet, and I want to make sure we get that right from the beginning, or at least it's considered before we do the zone change approval, just because, I mean, once the zone change happens, they can do whatever they want.
I think the issue, again, I sat this meeting before, and yes, it is frustrating because it's just the way it's structured. I get it. You know, those businesses are in what is called, you know, lawful non-conforming use, and for better or worse. And I remember, I mean, we literally pulled the receipts. I mean, there was deed books and maps from the 40s and 50s, and for better or worse, that use has essentially, or even more intense, has been there. And I remember the EPA conversation and this person essentially being made to vacate because of the impending fines that they would not be able to afford. And what I'm hoping we are looking to accomplish here is positive change in regulation for the area moving forward.
Right.
Again, you know, Mr. Bowen spoke to the issue of the overflow. I guess he and the adjoining property owner already have some understanding. I mean, I'm sure they do not want their business on their property, obviously, moving forward.
Right.
I'm familiar with your long-standing struggle with that issue, but I hope you understand that we're trying to take steps here to move forward in a positive fashion.
Can I ask, looking through this, I haven't looked at it in detail, but looking through each page, is your primary concern, it looks like the buffer is one concern.
Right.
And the other maybe primary concern is that taking out the issues that you're talking about in terms of
Right.
maybe some non-compliance of the agreement. The additional water flow that could be created
Water
by the
flow
parking
and-
lot paving?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the water flow, the buffer, and then also just the traffic congestion. Those are the three issues. Because I mean, there's no parking anywhere. I mean, that street is 1.5 cars wide really. By the time you park a car on there, only one car can get by. So I mean, it's already tight to begin with. You got the non-compliance at 110 that's cluttered the whole area up. I mean, all those cars that were pictured, if you could do that slide, show that one. Like all those cars, I mean, that's all 110, and then on one of the pages in the documents, it shows there's 4 or 5 more cars. That was just the other day. I mean, they're just parked everywhere. So just having a small use at 110 is already congested. I know they're building a parking lot and they'll contain their cars onto their spots, but you're still gonna have increased traffic. If they have more than, 5 cars parked, they're gonna have to park on the street somewhere, and where are they gonna park? I mean, parking is an issue.
I think you're planning for more parking than 5?
Yes. And I've talked to their attorney as well, and told them I'm not against what they're proposing to do. There's just some issues that I'd like to see addressed.
And that's
ahead
the
of
water
time.
flow and the buffer?
The buffer
And parking.
and the traffic just on that road.
I don't know that they can address the traffic, but they could address the parking,
But
buffer,
I mean, that's
and
where the
water flow.
planning commission
Potentially
comes in.
water
If a scenario can't support the traffic, why would you approve it and say, well, add more businesses and send more traffic to it? So,
Well, that's why I brought up about the apartments. They could go in there legally right now and put 3 apartments in there. You'd have 9 cars coming and going
Right.
at a time. That's
Mhm.
exactly
At least
what
9,
I'm saying.
depending on how many
right.
people lived in the apartments,
That's
yeah.
exactly right. So,
But they'd be parked there most of the time. They wouldn't be coming all day long, or they wouldn't be like business hour kind
well,
of.
I can't see this though being the kind of business
Right
it's
now.
gonna have.
but-
You're gonna come, you're gonna stay for an hour and a half. I would think. And you probably feel the same way about it, like I said, for what the use is. And
Right.
I think we all totally understand what you're saying, but what we need to address that at is when they actually come with a plan, right?
All of this
Right?
will be addressed in
All
the
this will be
development plan.
addressed when that plan.
Which is what I'm always told, but at that point, it's like, well, it's zoned when you're supposed to, you can't go backwards at that point. So I want to make sure up front that we're all on the same page, because,
Yes.
I mean, their plan isn't terrible. Their first drawing, their first drawing that they had submitted, which had some road issues, but I was actually fine with their first drawing. So, I mean, we're close, it's just, I want to make sure we're all on the same page before I have to deal with
Okay.
even more and be back here more times.
Can I speak for just a quick second?
Sure,
To
sure.
you mostly. I think that.
Come on back up here.
I think you should probably use our presence here
Mhm.
as just an introduction to the fact that we're here to do it the right way.
Right.
If we weren't here, we would just be there, fixing up that building and doing some other lawfully or unlawfully non-conforming use. So the fact that we're here, we're spending tens of thousands of dollars to do this.
Mhm.
It should reassure you and make you feel good inside about the fact that we're intending to do this right and improve the area. And any issues that you have with 110, I think that unfortunately has to be separate from our discussion here.
Right.
And maybe as a neighbor, we can help you deal with that on down the road. But there are probably some things that they've got to deal with.
Mhm.
But I do think we're gonna be an asset to the street. I think it's gonna look a lot better. We're gonna obviously follow all the necessary requirements of the planning commission. If we weren't going to, we wouldn't be here spending
Right.
thousands of dollars.
I talked to
do this,
Doc
so.
this afternoon for a little bit, and he assured me the same things too. So that's why I don't disagree with your plan, I just want to make sure all the ducks are in a row.
I invite
before we
you,
start.
I invite you to come back, I'm sure you will, but I think it'd be a great idea for you to come back along through this process so you can have your input, because you'll see that we're gonna do things by the letter of law.
Mhm.
As well as we can with the help of the commission and anybody else that owns property. So, thank you.
This
Ross?
zone change is also, it only sticks if our development plan goes through. So, if our development plan doesn't go through, this zone change goes back.
Yes, so really, I think a lot of it is just, we're talking about things that'll be later on, so.
Yeah. The water issue, Ben will, have to address with them, and they're not allowed to just have runoff off of the parking lot. It's got to be controlled, and so.
Right. And the reason I bring up the water issue is any business that would go in there would need to have a paved parking lot. That's gonna double the runoff, but at a minimum. So that should be considered before you say, well, go ahead and just put a business there. There are no storm sewers in that area. So, I mean.
That has to be addressed.
So, I mean, that should be addressed before you say, well, go ahead and put a business and pave a parking lot, because it's.
But it's
There's a
addressed in the
step-
development plan, so we can't
It's
address
addressed
it
in
now.
a different area, at a different time.
Yeah, when you can't go back, and now you've got this.
Well, it doesn't have to be.
But you can't
approved,
go
but they
forward.
But the
back
water
to-
issue has to be addressed in the development plan, so
Okay.
understanding you have an issue, and they will, in the
Concern,
development
yeah.
plan, address that, or it won't be approved. So all we can say now is reassure you that the development plan will address that, because that's what the planners do, is make sure that they address it.
Well, I mean, that means I've got to look at the development plan and see if it actually
Yeah,
includes
yeah,
that knowledge.
absolutely, yeah, and you're welcome to come back for that.
I was just gonna add, I calculated it, they could do 5 units there under the
Okay.
current R2 zoning. So
Okay.
If it was
5
apartments.
units with a parking lot and
Mhm.
building coverage, so
Okay,
that stormwater would have to be addressed at the development plan stage, whether they do this or.
right.
or
So if we didn't change the zone at all, they could put 5 units in there and pave over it, as long as they met.
But, yeah, they'd still have to deal with the runoff, because there's no,
But there are
Right.
calculations that they have to meet, so,
Yeah.
and that hard-nosed fellow there's got to prove that.
and then on the second page of the handle, there's a topographical map showing where the property lines are. The PDA map is incorrect, it's got the blue lines, the red line is closer to their actual property lines. So, I mean, they go down almost to the creek, there's maybe 15, 20 feet of property that I own on that side of the creek, and then it goes up a steep hill to where their lot is leveled off.
For Deshay, up the hill toward Deshay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then,
While this,
yeah, on this, I mean, this is at creek level, it goes from the creek, it's probably a 20-foot climb up to the top of their lot. Someone came in and filled that in, I'm sure they didn't get permits or anything else for that, they just pushed dirt, and that part of my land is completely unusable, so I mean, that's like another zoning conforming use issue and all that stuff that I have to do.
Are you talking about the area that probably at one time was like a formal garden off the rear of your property?
No, this is
It'd be
further to
further-
the right and then all the way to the back. And this is actually on the West Penn property, there's no street address to it, because it's landlocked in the floodplain, you can't do anything with it, so it's never been given a street address.
This
It's
is on the
spelled
property
West.
that has the house on it, right? That you're talking about, or do you own an adjoining?
Yeah, I
parcel?
own the lot to the west.
You also own,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I own both of those. And then the last issue is the landscape buffer, and then again, that goes back to the development plan. But, I mean, the planners have already indicated that they would approve a 5-foot buffer with a fence that's on the last page of the handout. When you get to that point, you're talking about the Swante Pub versus Hoffman residence conflict that's been going on for forever and will never end, basically. I mean, that's what you're doing. There was a 6-foot fence, and they have 5 feet and some trees, and that's what you have between Hoffman's and Swante Pub. So if the planners are gonna approve a 5-foot buffer, then I'm 100% against changing it to a B1. Just because I don't wanna deal with noise, if I don't hear or see them, that's fine, I don't care what they do at that point. But if they can park a food truck in their parking lot for a special event 5 feet from my property, fire up their generators, just like the Swante did to the Hoffmans, I mean, you're gonna have problems. So I'm not in favor of that 5-foot buffer. It should be the 15 at least. And then changing the use, you should look at the largest use that could be there. And I've talked to Joe some about this. The Family Dollar and Dollar General are on R1 lots down on South Broadway. They see 1,000 to 3,000 people per day. So, I mean, once you say, well, this is R1, I mean, the development plan would have to be approved, which it probably won't, but you're saying a Dollar General or Family Dollar store could go on that lot. So, things like that need to be considered, and then you put a 5-foot buffer, now I've got the Family Dollar parking lot in my backyard, basically. I mean, there's a fence, but it goes back to what you have with the Hoffmans and Swante Pub.
But that's why we're here, you know, we wouldn't be approving something that was acceptable, but you could get 1,000 cars a day down there. That's ridiculous, you know. That wouldn't fly at all, just because
Swante Pub got approved, so.
I would say that Main Street district, when you have a house on Main Street, then there are certain things that you expect in
Right.
terms of a business district, and
But
that
I mean,
house
as far as
abuts a
the
business
5-foot buffer,
district.
they should have had a bigger buffer, which you really can't do because there's no space. But that's kind of what we're talking here. It's a limited space as well. So that's my concern with it. As long as it's addressed, that's fine. The 5-foot buffer is a deal killer for me.
The gentlemen have said that they would be insulated and there would,
Well,
should
the
not
first
be
plan would
noise.
have been fine. They did a revised drawing because there's issues with the turnaround and all that stuff.
Yeah.
The revised plan is what would have had the 5-foot buffer. So,
Right.
I mean, I can work with them and we can figure all that out. I just want to
Sounds like
bring
they
the
want to
concern up.
hear your concerns and be a good neighbor, so it might be a good idea to talk to them separately even.
If I could just throw one thing out, Mr. Chairman. I certainly understand your concern about Family Dollar and all that. I can't imagine they've got that many people. But I'm not disputing
Yeah, I
that.
talked to the managers. She said especially since Dollar General's closed for whatever issue, they're seeing over 1,000 people a day.
Well, you're talking about the bigger one on out.
Oh, yeah, South
All
Broadway.
right, in that case, I won't even argue that at all. But one huge difference is that's on US 25, which is what, a 3 or 4 lane, whatever that is out there.
Yeah, they're located 100 feet off of Broadway. This would be 400 feet off Broadway.
Still
But, no,
completely
they're
different.
on it.
You don't
I
have to
mean,
turn onto another
they're
street
on
to
it.
get there. They're on Broadway.
They're on,
They
I
do
mean,
have-
they're on a
It
major
faces
highway.
out to Broadway though.
This is never, ever going to
Right.
be on a major highway.
But it's still
That-
B1, so why
Well,
wouldn't
it'd
that
still
be
be
two?
one, but they're not gonna have the same capacity to do what Family Dollar, or whichever dollar it is doing on South Broadway. That's a major road. Penn is never gonna be a major road, period. So, yes, uses by category are the same, location is incredibly different. So, yes, if this folds up, they can do some other B1 use on it,
Right.
but it's gonna be more in line with a mom and pop corner store. It's not gonna be Family Dollar with, good Lord.
I don't think a corner store, I think it's even gonna be businesses just like this that aren't looking to drive business from location. This isn't a place you go past because you stop because you pass by and say, oh, that looks interesting, or oh, I need a
Specific
jug of
use.
milk.
This is a
You-
destination business with a
Exactly.
purpose.
So people, anybody doing this site there is gonna be because
Can
they
they
have
put a
a
liquor
specific
store in there?
need. I'm sorry?
Could they put a liquor store in there? Because that's retail, community-based.
Why would somebody put a liquor store in there? Because
Well,
nobody's
one day
gonna
if they
frequent it.
decide it doesn't work and liquor
Well,
makes
I
a
think
lot
we
of
have to
money.
assume that there's common sense business people that are gonna say, am I gonna put a liquor store at the end of Penn Avenue? Where nobody's gonna see it, and there's one right across the street that faces out to Broadway, right?
But, I mean, they've got them in the area, so there's demand, so it's,
Yeah, but you have to think about location and any reasonable business person, if they're actually gonna put something that's trying to drive retail traffic there. I'm not saying
I mean, that goes
any,
back to,
if you wanna say, could it ever happen, I mean, obviously, you never say never, but the likelihood of that is like 0.00001%.
that goes back to my initial points of like 110, if they said that they had the largest paint stripping facility in Kentucky. You ever figured that would be on a residential lot and on a dead-end street in Georgetown? I mean, everything
And
I've dealt with
unfortunately, that
shouldn't-
happened way
shouldn't
before our
happen.
time in history, right, that allows it, so.
And advertising is always true, sure.
That wasn't before your time, but that came in like 2015,
Oh, yeah, no, that was,
the
that's
paint
recent.
stripping.
Yeah.
No, that paint stripping is recent, yeah.
I mean, it's
But
just because
would
my
you
personal.
rather have this or another paint stripping place back in there?
Well, those aren't allowed. I mean, they were never allowed, so.
But it was there once before, somebody could. I guess
Illegal.
somebody
So,
could
and that's
do it.
why I'm here ahead of time to make sure we're getting this all
I'd
straightened
rather
out.
much have these
And that's
guys
what
do
we're,
that.
we're here for, also is to assure you that we're gonna look at these in the proper sequence and the proper steps, and that the development plan will address some of these items that have been your concern, and these two gentlemen have said they're willing to talk with you, and you said you've been willing to talk with them, so
Yeah.
let's let the process work.
Okay. All right. I'm also aware of like, well, what comes next? Because I guess they have kids in baseball, and that's why, part of the reason. So if the kids that you're working with grow up and you decide to move somewhere, you want to sell the business and someone else comes in, well, then what comes next? Because I would be stuck with that 5-foot buffer no matter what comes next. So
Then
that's.
you buy it, then we would sell you. Then we would be bound by the laws and the ordinance to proceed forward with a different business plan.
Right.
Nothing has changed.
I'm just used to none of that's happened in that area, pretty much ever.
Understand.
So
You've been- it
it's-
seems like you've been
that's
burned
my
before, and we
concern. It's not you
understand that.
guys that I question anything you're doing, but it's just that area and what I've personally
It
had
has
to deal
some bad
with.
history.
To understand.
I just had a quick question. How long have you lived in that,
2016?
2016? Yeah. I was just curious.
Thank you, sir. Josh or Ross, Joe, could you get that picture back up? Or Doc? Do you know where the property line is?
Yes. Which part do you want to see?
Your all's property line between you and 110?
So it basically runs right here, right along their gravel.
Okay,
So if you can see the east corner of our building, so between us and 110, the survey, the past survey and our current survey that we've got performed indicate that the property line is 4 feet east of our building.
okay, so those two white trucks at the top are on their property?
That's on 110.
So this
On
right
110.
here is
Okay.
it's not gravel.
Right.
That is poured concrete that's on the slope.
Okay,
So that will be removed and a retaining wall put in between.
gotcha, all right. And so the two black trucks down there are on your property?
They're on our property.
Gotcha, thank you much. All right, any other discussions? Yes, sir.
I'll be brief. My name's David Stewart. I own or have an equity interest in about 6 acres around all this, and I've dealt for 40 years with the problems that Steve has indicated, and there's no exaggeration to what he said. We have fought and fought and fought, and have gotten nowhere. I don't really have any problem with what they want to do there, but I do have concerns. And what I heard, I believe this gentleman say, and I'm not sure I've ever heard it said before, but I want to make sure that if this development plan fails, the property automatically reverts to R2?
No.
Well, that's what he said.
No, he said that it will stay as a B1. If we approve it for B1 and that business fails, it would still be a B1.
Okay, so the decision you make today is a final decision with regard to that piece of property?
No,
Has to
no,
be
this is a
approved.
recommendation to the city council.
But it's final as to the B1?
No, it's a recommendation to the city council. City council would have to approve it as B1. Once they approve it, that's fine.
Then it's fine.
And then they come in with development plans, and we deal with the issues that Mr. Wire was bringing up.
Okay, so if as he says, and I don't want him to fail because I think it's a good idea, it's a quiet usage at that spot, and hopefully it's not going to be an intrusive usage. But I'm concerned about what may follow if that fails, and I'm certainly not wanting apartments down there. It seems to me, given over the years my experience with apartments has not been that good, although I own about 120 right now, but it's all you can handle with the class of person who's now renting from you. So I think this would be a much better use. Do we have any say-so, or do we have any control, or do we have any input on the design of the building?
No.
Joe?
No, not on the design.
Is it, I was hoping that it would follow a design that is compatible with the streetscape. That seems to have been the intent for years, to try to correct the problems. I know when we had the issue with this building, Charlie and I worked out an agreement for the construction of the green building in order to hide the ugly building behind it, which you all were not inclined to find improperly built and operated. And that's worked pretty well because it was a soft comment on that streetscape, and it really, there was no real interference with what was going on there. I'm a little concerned about Ms. Bruin's property, which is the little house at the end. She's lived there for 75 years. I'm shocked to understand that that's commercial.
That's commercial?
Yeah, it's B2. I would.
Well, anyway, that really surprised me because there's been nothing there but residential since the beginning of time.
Well, but the plan is just a long-range kind of vision for what it can be. It's not necessarily a reflection of traditional use.
Yeah, I follow what you're saying. I'm most concerned about the hydrology. What's deceiving about what you see on a flat screen is that this land is not flat. There is between a 15 and 20 foot drop from the corner of North Broadway and Penn to Royal Spring Branch. The water pours down there. The city does not provide any drainage. There's 1,000 feet of drainage on the west side of North Broadway, which comes down, cuts the corner, and comes rushing down the street. You can put gravel along there to the side of the road to try to build it up, and one gully washer, which I now understand what that means. It's all gone by the end of the storm. So what I'm concerned about is what I understand, and I'm just beginning to understand, is what they call pre-development flows and post-development flows. And the amount of water that's going to be discharged from what was, and is right now, mostly grass and landscaped lawn, except for where the building is. And if it turns out that the post is greater than the pre, then we're facing a detention basin. And that really concerns me. I don't know where that would go. I don't know how that would affect what I call Lot 4, the lot that Mr. Wire owns beyond. But it's a very serious concern about what it's going to take if, in fact, the post is greater than the pre, and what then is the answer. I just don't know what to do about that. Now, with regard to this cul-de-sac issue, I own the mill. The road that they showed the last picture of is a very narrow road coming down there. Over time, as this new horror at 110 has moved in, and I know that's not for you to consider, but it's certainly something to understand. They have come over with these roll trucks and these enormous trucks that carry cars. They come down there, they come onto my property, they're just tearing the hell out of the ground down there. And the reason that's occurring is not because of anything structurally unsound. It's because the city, with this water issue, has built a drainage trough for Ms. Bruin because water was coming into her house. And it borders on my land there. But the water is not going to a great extent in that drainage trough. It's coming onto my land. So anytime a large truck from what I'm concerned about, 112 eventually, and 110 is coming down there and turning around, because that's the only place they can do it is on my private property, it's causing damage. I was landscaping down there and bought a 12-foot, no, maybe an 8-foot cypress tree, paid $200 or $300 for it, planted it, and they completely butchered it, ran completely over it 100 feet into my property, because it takes that much use of my land for one of those enormous trucks to go down there and turn around. So I'm really concerned if 112 is going to serve food eventually, whether these trucks that you see parked in the middle of Main Street delivering to the various restaurants, how are they going to get in there, and how are they going to turn around without coming onto my property? So I'm very concerned about that. Tomorrow, I'm blocking that driveway of mine. There's not going to be any traffic coming on there, and it's going to create quite an issue. Ms. Bruin has posted I don't know if you saw a picture of the little mailbox. Mm-hmm. That's right at her corner where it joins. She's posted a sign there because they're actually parking in her driveway. Huge truck down there the other day for quite some length of time. No way for an ambulance to get to her. She's really up in years. Her daughters can't get down there to her. I have let her come on to my property and have access through a back way, but that's not something that I let anybody else do. And I'm worried about this heavy truck traffic that is, tends to be degrading what I've got down there. So I'm really concerned about that. To answer your question, I have seen the water of Royal Spring Branch this high over my head, standing on the bridge. Not my private bridge that was at the big house. And so it floods. Something, I've seen it several times over the fence post. The other thing I'm concerned about is all of this aggregate that was illegally brought in over the years. The 110 building, since all of this was on a slant, they had to bring in all this aggregate to create level parking. And so it's a stair-step effect. And when you go and look, you'll see that. What I'm concerned about is when they tear into this embankment, which must be 4.5 feet tall, to do that retaining wall, if that's something you all are going to look at and very seriously consider the ramifications of the land moving. What many of you probably don't know is that the house on the corner of North Broadway and Penn had to take off and completely rebuild the entire rear wall of that house because it had moved. It was bowing. And I've seen erosion at 108, where over the years they've come in and leveled the ground out. So that's I'm really concerned about that when they get in there. Especially at 112, an enormous amount of dirt and aggregate and junk was brought in there to level that ground. And I don't know what they're going to get into, but I'm just offering that as a warning that there's a lot of issues under the surface, and where you think that green grass is lovely, there are all sorts of surprises. What else? Of course, I was involved on the periphery with the liquor store that you mentioned and the pawn shop. Very strict limitations were placed on their ability to post signs and to post electric lights, all sorts of lighting. And just as soon as they got the approval and you told them what they could and could not have, they go right down and they post whatever they want to. So I'm really concerned about the type of lighting that might be on this building and whether it would be designed in such a way as to attract people driving down Broadway so they will see that there's something down there. That concerns me. I know the liquor store, the lights are on all night. And those neon lights are terrible. And at the pawn shop, it's just as bad. But I don't think they would do that because they are not going to have that much space in there for a lot of customers. But I'm still concerned about that. And will that be a part of your review? And how will that be? Do you ever go out and look at what?
Whenever they submit the development plan, they'll also have to submit, if they're going to have any signage, there will be usually an engineer of some sort provides us with exactly what the sign they intend to order looks like, exactly how it's lit, Mr. Krebs, et cetera. If they do have any lighting in the parking lot, that is mandated a certain way as well. Usually, almost always, all that stuff comes to us as a blueprint. Almost any new business that's going to have any sort of lit sign or any sort of signage at all, they engage a company that's going to design the things for them, specific to the limitations, both lighting and dimensions. And usually it'll show up probably in the development plan or later.
And it all has to meet engineering standards, and none of that's going to address Broadway there. And nothing they do is going to address Broadway.
They're not gonna try to get people to turn from Broadway based off of their flashing
They will
neon
not
signs.
be allowed a tall monument sign,
Yeah.
like a McDonald's sign or anything of that nature. That's,
Like at the liquor store.
well,
Okay. I think that's.
David, I commend you for starting tomorrow, blocking that entrance, and that may cut down on some of that.
Well, I try to get along, but
Yeah.
I'm just not gonna put up.
I wouldn't have gotten along this long.
I mean, if I were y'all, I'd be having the vehicles towed, personally.
Well,
I'd be on the phone with Teddy Clark immediately.
it costs
Come
me
get
money.
this truck.
I've had the police down there, and they say, well, yeah, you go on and tow it if you want to, but we're not paying for it. So I have to send it and call Teddy Clark, get him to come and get it. I don't ever get my money back. And the last guy I caught down there, he was passed out on heroin, and I got the police out there, and they pulled him out and arrested him. And then the truck sat down there for 2 months while he was in jail. I didn't want to have it towed because I figured he was facing enough trouble as it was. But we run into that situation down there all the time. And there's no real answer about enforcement. And that's what concerns me. We just sort of do what we think is best. But I will block that tomorrow.
Good for you.
The other thing I'm concerned about is the one, and I think you said that was preliminary, the one proposed diagram showed a circle in dotted lines, which seemed to intrude on Ms. Bruin's driveway and on my land. And I
So like this?
I got the feeling that it was sort of a harbinger of maybe what somebody might cook up as a scheme to condemn that land and create a turnaround down there.
Isn't that just a reflection of what the turnaround is now? That's got nothing to do with any
Nothing.
official plan.
No.
No, that's just where it is now in relation to the drawing that they've submitted.
Okay. All right, well then that's it. I wish them well, and I look for a really pretty building that will fit the landscape. Thank you.
Were you sworn in, by the way? Did you come in after the swearing?
I swear.
You swear? Thank
That
you.
everything I said is.
I figured you would. I just wanted to make sure.
All right. Do we have anyone else that would like to address this proposal?
If not, I make a motion to accept the zone change as presented.
As recommended to the legislative body.
Yes.
We never did open.
So do we close it now or not?
Joe, I messed up, because I never did open the public hearing for this.
Well, why don't you close it and nobody will ever know the difference.
Now you've admitted it on camera, Charlie.
It was advertised as a public hearing.
Yeah.
And I had it highlighted right here.
That highlight's good enough for me. Close the public
All
hearing.
right,
and
so
move
we
on.
will close it there. And then we had a proposal by Mr. Jesse.
You want me to say the number? The, you want me to say that?
For approval. Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Have a motion and a second to approve this. Ms. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Shirley,
Yes.
Mr. Jesse,
Yes.
Mr. Vest,
Yes.
Mr. Stone,
Yes.
Mr. Garrett,
Yes.
Mr. Green,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes.
Joe, just as a point of clarity for the adjoining property owners, for the next step of the process, they will be re-notified.
There will not be a notice sent for the council meeting?
No, development plan.
Oh, for the development plan, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
just so-
If the zone change is approved, you'll get another notice when they submit the development plan.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for clarifying that, Brad.
Just want them to make sure they've got their opportunity.
The next item on the agenda is a text amendment for the RV campground, and that is a public hearing. So we will open the public hearing for discussion on the text amendment for the RV campground. Oh, yeah, okay, right there. All right, Matt?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief in my comments. We
That's what
we
David
went over
said.
we went over it in great detail last month. We do have some recommendations, recommended changes based on the testimony that we heard last month, and I'll go over those. And then I'll take any
Been
questions.
more
you all
changes
may have.
since our workshop?
Not since, well, there have been a few since workshop.
Okay, I thought we had a new
some-
one, so.
Yeah, some of our discussion we've had with,
Okay.
you know, Mr. Murphy and his client. But just so, I guess also the public hears, you know, we are recommending those sites that may not be on public sanitary sewer. We're now recommending a maximum density of 5 units an acre. We have revised that part. We are also sort of in conjunction with that, since our community has had problems with private sewer systems in the past. We're recommending that there be some sort of reporting system, so the applicant or property owner of a campground would go into some sort of agreement with either the legislative body or with the local health department, basically saying that they will have semi-annual reports about the operations and condition of the system. If they don't provide those reports every 6 months, they would be subject to the campground being closed until those reports are provided. In addition, if there's any issues with the operations or the condition of the system, they would be subject to closing down until those are corrected as well. And a provision in there also that if there are any issues, the operator has to notify the local health department immediately upon any discovery of a failure in the system. Other changes, we clarified that the campgrounds have to have access from an arterial or collector road, at least 20 feet in width, with shoulders on them. And I had some discussion with Mr. Murphy. We would be, we do have in here that we're specifying that 200 or more requires a second entrance connection, and then I believe it was 500 or more have to have a third connection. Those secondary and tertiary entrances, if they're not intended to be used regularly, we want to be very clear. Those can be gated, and they can be constructed, to a lesser standard than a county road standard. We want to make sure that they are at a standard that the county fire department or city fire department, if applicable, is okay with, because we want to make sure that fire trucks, which are typically the heaviest vehicle that would use such an access point, that it's to their standard, that they're not, it's wide enough, it's going to support the weight of a full fire truck. So we wanted to make sure that that's clear.
Is that reflected in here now, or is it in the language?
That's not reflected in there now, but I think it's just something we would have an understanding if somebody comes with an application and they're showing that, the second
Right.
access point would be, gated and closed for regular, just everyday use, we would not apply that standard. We specified that internal driveways, just for regular everyday use would have to meet, the road standards of the applicable jurisdiction, and that they would have to be able to be served by a public water system. In the previous drafts, we had written municipal water system, and Mr. Murphy pointed out there could be some confusion if somebody thought that might apply only to GMWSS, but we wanted to clarify in Kentucky, or in Scott County, we also have access to Kentucky American water, which is also obviously acceptable. Those are the major changes that we're proposing from both what was discussed last month and what was we discussed at workshop. I guess the other item that Mr. Murphy had raised at last month's meeting, it's not reflected here in the text amendment, but there was some question about whether or not properties that might run along major creeks like the North Elkhorn, if we would require fencing that the ordinance calls for. And I think in those cases, we would entertain, waivers to those requirements where it seems reasonable, like we would with other parts of our regulation. So I didn't feel like it was necessary to write something into the ordinance for those exceptions, just because my fear would be that we would end up with people trying to claim that ditches and things like that counted as streams that we need to waive the requirements along those features. I think that's all that I have at this time.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Dick Murphy. I'm here on behalf of the Kentucky Bluegrass Experience Resort, and Andrew Hopewell, back in the corner, is the person behind the Kentucky Bluegrass Experience Resort. I don't have too much to say. We said a lot last month, and we appreciate you all hearing our witnesses and hearing us last month. And we appreciate very much Mr. Summers and the staff working with us. I think there's a lot of regulation in here, but we feel that what the version that Mr. Summers is presenting to you is something that we can work with, and that we can have a, hopefully develop under the framework of this regulation, a very nice resort for the community. Obviously, we'll have to come back and get a zone change, and you'll have to see us again, but we think this is an ordinance which gives a framework that we can work with. Just wanted to point out, as Mr. Summers mentioned, we appreciate the changing the water system from being named a municipal water system to a public water system. And that's because we have a Kentucky American main on our property, which is available to us. We don't want to be somebody say, well, no, you can't use the main that's right there, already on it. And similarly, I talked, as Mr. Summers mentioned to him, I talked that the ordinance does require the 6-foot fence along the borders with other uses. And we were very concerned about that because, as I mentioned to you, we have 2.1 miles of frontage on South Elkhorn Creek, and that's also our property border. And it just wouldn't be appropriate to put a 6-foot fence along the edge of the creek. So Mr. Summers assured us that we could ask for a waiver of that. So we're not asking you to change the ordinance, but obviously when we come in, we'll be presenting a waiver to you on that as well. And also the references to the local health department about who would be reviewing our sanitary sewage plan on that. We have to present that to the local health department. As I think we mentioned last month, we have a letter from Mr. Chris Edwards at the state cabinet of public health, who said that the system we're proposing is an approved system for Kentucky. I spoke to him again after the meeting we had last month, and he said, yeah, he said, here's how it works. He said, this is an approved system for Kentucky, but you will go to the local health department and get it approved, and then they'll consult with me, and we'll make sure that the system that's approved for Kentucky is done correctly on this particular site. So you have to work through the local health department. The state also has input to it as well. So I think those were, we worked on a number of other things, but like I said, I really appreciate opportunity to present to you last month and to work with Matt and the staff on that. And as I said, I think we've got an ordinance that we can work with on this.
Great. Glad that you feel that way. And I would like to say thank you to you and Mr. Hopewell for bringing the folks in about that Fuji Clean last month. That was very eye-opening, and with the sewage capacity that we have here in Scott County right now, that may be something we have to look at for other developments, or other developments may want to look at there. So.
Maybe it can count as continuing education.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you. All right, do we need to close the public hearing before we vote or after?
Anybody else want to speak?
If nobody's jumping up, yes, sir.
Yeah, no, we have another speaker, Mr. Cornett.
Oh, I thought he was just approving, not saying I want to talk. Well, that changes everything.
I'm all for the RV park to talk about there. So my concern is this ordinance is related to the entire county, not just the park they're talking about doing over outside Midway. There's some points I want to make going future, and I'm thinking maybe Northern Scott County. It says in there you got to have fire hydrants. To have a fire hydrant, you got to have a big 6-inch line or thereabouts. we've got sections in the county that don't have that big a water line, therefore you can't put a fire hydrant in. Out in Ironworks Estates, a few years ago, we had a situation where we had, I think, I remember it was 3-inch lines that fed that. At the time, the water company said, well, sorry to mess it up, you gotta put a 6-inch line in. So we had a 3-inch line feeding 6-inch line. So we put it in, satisfied the system. And then they realized after the fact, well, that was probably a mistake. So just raise that question that there are areas in the county, as far as I know, the entire county's got city water thanks to George Husband fiscal court a few years ago. But just that's a question that your fire hydrant might be an overkill if there is no water supply to take care of that. Talked about cabins, having to have a 5-acre density. Define cabin. Going back to the campground we've got in Florida, we've got a bunch of park models down there, and I'm not sure exactly what the size of the park model is, but 12 or 14 feet, or maybe 35 feet is a park model. So that falls under the.
It's usually bigger than 400 square feet. to be a
Okay,
park lot.
sound like you've been looking it up, that's fine, yeah. And so, are we talking about 5 acres for one of these park models, or are we talking about 5 acres for a full-fledged cabin?
So which part talks about 5 acres for a cabin?
I'm sorry?
Which part talks about 5 acres for a cabin?
That's something I saw last night, maybe that's right.
That was for caretakers and whatnot, the examples you gave, and it said 5 acres.
That's not being proposed to change. That part's in the A1R.
Okay, I just what I'm getting at, if they've got some park models in there, I don't think the 5-acre density is appropriate, what I'm saying.
No, 5-acre density would not apply to camp, that's sort of what this would do.
Okay.
It would not apply to campgrounds.
Public water, another question I had, I don't think that's an issue anywhere in Scott County, but our campground in Florida, we're on well. We've got 1,500 sites down there, we're on water, we're on a private well. And so there may be areas where the public water's not available, if you provide adequate water, that's something to consider. Again, I don't think that's gonna be a problem here in Scott County, but it is an issue. Again, I can't do out the country and.
Would there be, if you were gonna put a place that big that didn't have water in Scott County, would the road be big enough to handle that? I'd be totally against that.
That's another question too.
Yeah, any place that's got enough road frontage should have water in this county.
That's probably true in this county, you're
Yeah.
right. Which leads me to another thing, the requirement of a second access point with, if you got over 200 units, I think that's still a little bit restrictive. I realize the fire department says that, but we're not talking about a campground with any big structures that are gonna require a whole lot. I'd say most likely used to be trying to get an ambulance in, bringing all the fire apparatus and stuff in. Just, that's not gonna happen likely because you don't have big structures and stuff in a campground like that. So, I don't
All
think-
we're saying is that there should be a second entrance in case of an emergency. It doesn't have to be used all the time. Like we said, it can be gated and locked. But, you know, the example that we use from time to time is Cherry Blossom. You go in there and the only front entrance goes across that bridge. If that bridge collapses, then those folks are stuck in there, nobody can get in.
That's a legitimate point, but you got a bunch of structures back there.
Yeah, but same thing if you had an emergency, needed, ambulances in there. There's a wreck or somebody has a heart attack and that only entrance is blocked. We're just saying have a second entrance so emergency vehicles can get in there. And it doesn't have to be used all the time.
I don't have any problem with that if it's feasible, but just for example, these guys, we're talking about a mile going back to where the campground is. You
Yeah.
gotta build a bridge across the creek. That's a huge infrastructure. To put a second entrance in, that's a pretty serious development cost thing. And so if it's feasible, I don't have any problem with it, but if you're in a situation where you gotta build 2 miles of road, 2 bridges, and that's starting to get a little bit overzealous, in my opinion, so.
I just say just don't do it then. I mean, we can't, it's also not feasible to say, well, everybody should be able to do something cheap and they're far off the road, that's their choice to spend that kind of money. They can if they want to, but we can't just green light everything and say, well, I'm sorry, we don't want you to spend a lot of money. Well, that's your thing. If you want to spend
We've got 1,500 sites there in Florida on one entrance. Some of you guys have been there. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Could it be as even, the language isn't super restrictive, I mean, could it even just be as simple as a fire gate in the road frontage fence road, or the property line adjoining or something? I mean, the language isn't super restrictive, the language doesn't mandate, you know, identical access as the primary.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't, I mean, it would need to be some sort of surface that could handle a heavy vehicle. I mean, you wouldn't want, you know, just 2 inches of, or an inch of gravel, you know, that a fire truck might sink into if it's a really, you know, if it's been raining a lot. So it'd have to be some sort of surface that could handle a heavy load, or even if it's, you know, a secondary access point that for some reason, you know, RVs need to leave the site using, you know, you don't want people sinking down into that and getting stuck. So I don't think like a gate by itself would be fine. I think there needs to be some sort of surface that can handle heavier vehicles.
But let me ask you this, does the language mandate that as it's written? I know what we're thinking, you know.
Yeah, I don't believe that it does.
Right. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not trying to skirt
Yeah.
the issue, I'm trying to toe the line here of, and then again, I don't know exactly if this is all gonna be subject to waiver and variance at all, or is it ironclad? Because, especially with the topography and, you know, the water features we do have in this area of the state.
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
I think
6
similar.
of one, half dozen the other.
Similar to the discussion we had about the ag buffers ordinance, I mean, we don't generally support putting language in an ordinance that, you know, would take away your ability to grant, you know, waivers and variances, because sometimes situations, you know, make it necessary that you do that.
Well, I think Roy brings up a really good point, you know. I don't think with his family's experience and myself having lived in Florida, that's a pretty big difference. You're saying you had 1,500 sites with one, and we're talking about anything over 200 having two. Just wondering, is it an overkill? I'm trying to understand. So why is it in Florida they can have the 50? I'm just curious, what's the, you know more about the rules there than how do they do that? So.
Yes, I mean, Red's been down there, I mean, there's literally one entrance that goes into this 1,500. Now, there is a back road that we can get to, it's kind of a secondary road, if you will, that we can use for stuff. Occasionally, it's just nothing but a dirt road. I think, okay, another thing that's thought of, the fire hydrant thing, these guys on the Elkhorn Creek, fire department's got pumpers, they go out there and pump out of the creek. They're supposed to have hydrants there. There's other alternatives.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I hate to take any language out that, you know, removes a step of safety. But hydrants and things of that nature almost come down to an issue between them and their insurance company, really, you know, and the feasibility of their business plan.
If I could clarify, the hydrants aren't mandated unless the fire departments, the way it's written, aren't mandated unless the fire department says that they're needed.
During development
So
plan, I guess.
we sort of leave that up, because, you know, Scott County and Georgetown and, you know, Sadieville, they might all have different standards for how far apart they feel that hydrants need to be, or things of that nature. So the way it's written, hydrants aren't required unless the fire department says that they are.
Is there a way to structure the language that the issue of the entrance would also be at the discretion of emergency service providers? Would that make sense?
I don't know
That's
that
not
it's
as clear
always,
cut.
just the emergency, provider.
But I think that's the intent of this, right?
Yeah, but
Can you talk a little bit, I know we talked about it in the workshop, how you came up with the 2 per 200 relative to our other regs?
Relative to our regs, I mean, the 200 is similar to what we would require for some of our developments in, I guess, in the city or the county, particularly if you think about residential developments. And I know, you know, residential developments generate more traffic, but you know, once you get over a certain number of vehicles or people on a property, you know, you don't want them to be trapped there if an entrance gets blocked. I mean, or if, you know, traffic backs up, if there's some sort of you know, issue on the site and people were trying to leave, you know, you want there to be a way that people could get in and out, I guess through as many ways as you could.
I guess, may I ask our prospective new neighbors how you all interpret that language, and for your usage, how you imagine it working, and how you feel about the language as it is? Because, you know, obviously, more than likely, you all are probably the most intensive use that we'll see in the area and the most intensive infrastructure, and you guys are looking at those costs with this language here, so I'd be very curious to see how you all interpret it.
Well, last month when we were before you, we had proposed that the number be 400 on one entrance. And there are mainly two reasons for that. One is that these generate, a recreational vehicle isn't going to generate the traffic that a single-family house does. It's just much, much less. I mean, to a great degree less than what a single-family house does. And the second is that, of course, these are mobile. They're going to be coming in and out anyway. And we're not going to have, the park is not going to be filled up all the time. So it's not like we're always going to have the maximum number, whether it be 200 or 400. So we felt like 400 was a good number to put for be able to have one access and having to move to a second access point on that.
Well, I guess even more so, like for your all's development, I'm sure you've envisioned it. I haven't seen it, laid out yet, but do you already have in mind a second entrance that you were like, we have to have that for freight purposes or service vehicle usage or something? Basically, I'm trying to, is there a real world application that the language need be in there, or do you all intend and others intend just to, okay, we're gonna plan to have a secondary access point? Like, do we need to mandate it? I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, we don't have a second access point lined up, no. We have, they're in the realm of possibilities now. I mean, there's possibilities for a second access point, but we don't have, we can't point and say, hey, it'll be here or there. We just,
Yeah.
we don't have.
But it wasn't in the plan from the beginning regardless of what this says.
It was not in the plan at the beginning, no.
I was just kind of curious how you imagine yourselves operating, again,
Yeah.
thinking that probably y'all will be the most extensive use we have. And obviously, you being a learned man of liability and whatnot, you've analyzed those risks. You've probably dealt with or experienced similar developments before.
What does Whispering Hills have, how many units?
They were approved for 217, that's what their final development plan says.
How many entrances do they have?
They have one entrance, but they have frontage on a second road.
But we're not requiring that they have another entrance at this point, right?
I know, we would go back. and
Unless they had
proactively-
some, yeah.
Majority
So-
of them just have one.
Yeah, in this case, the expectations would be higher, obviously, for this one. And
It just seems in general, this just seems overly burdensome restriction on the number 200. I mean, it's what stands out to me. That, there is a big need. I think, Charlie, you and, sorry, David, you do camping and stuff. Do you see the bigger places? I mean, what's been your all's experience?
Ones we go to usually have one entrance. I personally would rather have two myself. Because we got a fifth wheel, 40 foot long, you put a big truck in front of it. You can line up and just, if fire trucks have to come in, to me it makes sense, but
at 200 or at more?
yeah, at 200.
You had mentioned, you said something about 400, Mr. Murphy?
Yeah, that's what they proposed last time.
Seems to me like you should keep the threshold for a second entrance fairly low or lower, because 200, I mean, that's a lot of people in there with one entrance. I mean, maybe, jump up to 1,000 or something for the third or a higher number, but the second one seems very important to be able to have a second way in and out of a place, because it's not just going to be the campgrounds if you tow a car behind. I mean, you probably have visitors too if you're there on a holiday. I mean, if it's going to be a resort, if there's things to do there, there might be family members coming and other visitors, but
And I
it just
have
seems
seen
like
fire
set the
trucks
threshold
there,
for two
too.
lower.
Is it less than the subdivision regs, given the less traffic? What is a subdivision?
Well, it's 200 for single family, I believe,
Yeah, is it?
100.
So understanding that you said it has less traffic, should it be higher? I'm not saying 400, maybe 300.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Should it be, understanding that there is less traffic, which I think everybody understands, should it be a little bit looser than the 200, maybe not 400, maybe 300?
Well, I mean,
To reflect
it's not
the,
just the traffic in and out, it's
Right.
the emergency access,
Yeah.
I think is the more important thing. So you'll have still, I mean, how many people do do you bring along in your camper?
But what does that have to do with anything?
But I mean, because
You don't have to worry
You
about people
have
if there's not a lot of
more
traffic, it's less
people
likelihood
there.
they're blocking the traffic from emergency vehicles, right?
I'm sorry.
If there's less traffic, there's less likelihood that emergency vehicle is going to be blocked by traffic. Right?
Well, that's true, but I'm more, I would think I would be more worried about the one entrance just being closed off in, some event of, I don't know, flood or, an accident at the entrance.
For egress, you mean?
Yes, yeah.
I'm thinking we also need to realize that while we keep saying entrance, it's not just a one-way path, so it'll be however wide it has to be for 2 campers, et cetera, to pass. And like, for example, like the nearest one here that's pretty large scale is down Mammoth Cave. Like the receiving area as you check in is massive. I mean, there's a parking area you could put a dozen trailers and I almost got you. Side to side there while you all check in, et cetera, whatever, and there's 2 or 3 lanes coming and going. So there is width there, that could allow, room for emergency access or whatever, say if there was traffic coming or going. I think that should be considered because we're not just talking about a golf cart.
Not talking about a one lane,
Yeah,
one car.
we're not just talking about a golf cart path,
Horse Park has 260 entrances.
What'd you say? Sorry?
The Horse Park has 260 on one entrance.
But they have a private exit in the back that takes you to the, yeah.
But it's dirt road.
No, it's
Isn't it?
blacktop.
Is it blacktop?
Then it says emergency use only, so.
Okay.
There's an accident that occurs where everybody comes in, somebody gets killed, that's gonna be shut down for, 6 hours maybe while they reconstruct and do all that. That traps everybody in there. I think that's the ideal world.
I mean, I definitely see both sides of it. I just think I'm trying to keep ourselves within industry standard.
Right. And not make ours overly
to retain
restrictive.
and attract
Yeah.
business. I totally get it. I totally do. I'm just trying to play almost devil's advocate because we're in somewhat unfamiliar territory, and then there are currently now modern industry standards, so to speak. It is, we're almost getting into the territory of grandfathered use and expectations. Trust me, I would love to be able to mandate all the safety for all the things, but you know what, maybe it's an overreach. I don't know. Because we do have to toe the line, because we're talking about commerce. I hate to, negate safety for it, and I would love for everybody to have a second entrance, because I agree, for me, it makes sense. If I were planning a place personally, and the topography and whatnot allowed for it, I would probably put one in regardless of what the ordinance said, which is why I was asking these folks. I don't know.
With the suggestion he was describing earlier about the one having such a wide entrance, that you're not gonna block that. I mean, I can't imagine the emergency being so that something like wide enough for whatever you said, 10 or 12. What if an alternative was offered? You give them an entrance like this, it's just highly unlikely to ever be blocked, or you give us a second entrance, at least up to, some number. Because I got to admit, if you've got to come to a second and you've got to build a bridge or you've got to do something extraordinary, that's not reasonable. If a safety issue can be taken care of by putting, and I had no idea, but say 100-foot entrance, rather than the usual 28 feet or whatever that might be.
Is there a standard or in terms of the width of the entrance?
Our roads are 24 feet wide, but our entrance will be obviously wider along with some big turning lanes.
And then, Mr.
We ran that Bluegrass Festival Horse Park for 45 years. I couldn't tell you how many times we've been out there and had traffic lined up coming in the Bluegrass Festival. Wasn't campers. The ambulance would come in, the ambulance just come in that second lane. They got in, they ain't problem.
In fact, they passed us one time I was ever out there. Came flying down, and people scattering, but they got in.
So having a second lane there,
Yeah.
work fine if somebody
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah, but you got like folks at Elkhorn, it's one way in, one way out. If they block it, you're stuck. And we're
Because that's
supposed
just
to be
one lane
doing.
traffic?
No, it's just one.
Yeah, that's what I mean, it's narrow, it's too narrow.
Oh, yeah.
So could it, instead of restricting by units, to Charlie's point, I think, of maybe it's better, or maybe a reasonable approach would be to specify, if you either have this size entrance so that there's ability for emergency traffic to get around, or you put in a second entrance at 200 units, right?
In fact, you could actually designate an emergency lane in the entrance.
Yeah.
That cannot, period, that's it, and everything else, then you've got to have sufficient for that.
Yeah, that seems a
That way
reasonable
it can't be
approach.
blocked.
Mr. Murphy, I have a question for you, that's okay. How did you come up with a number of 400? I was wondering where that number come from?
We felt that the traffic generation of the RVs was much less than half that of a single-family house. I know the standard here is
I see.
200 for a single-family house. So based on traffic generation, we were being pretty conservative, because if we just went on traffic generation alone, it would probably be more like 600,
Yeah, 600
800,
probably, yeah.
something like that. But we took 400 for that reason. I think the reason that the solution Mr. Perkins had suggested is a good one, because we could get a wider entrance to get people off, to make sure people can get on in lieu of a second entrance at the point of 200.
You were shaking your head, Joe, it seemed like you
Well, I
had.
was just thinking a lot of these are gonna be on major roads, which will be state roads, and I don't know if the state wants a 100-foot wide entrance or a really wide entrance. They would have to approve that, and we couldn't force them to approve a wide entrance, so I don't know.
But it was justified
But
from
if we
a
can't
safety
do that,
measure
then you got a
standpoint?
second entrance.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily speaking of, when I say entrance, I don't mean actually where it hits the state road, but once you, like the way it's set up at Mammoth Cave, is you come in a standard entrance, one, I don't know how many lanes, probably 2 or 3 right there, turning lane, straight lane, et cetera. And then once you get in, then it aprons out.
Yeah.
So that once you get into the like there's big parking area to the right-hand side, where you line up and then you get out of your vehicle, you go check in, whatever, there's this big center, and then,
alleviate the
yeah.
bottleneck where it is not wide. It can still then bottleneck before it widens out. If it's gotta be a wide entrance, although the state's got to approve it,
But if the state didn't approve it, to your point, then you have to have a second entrance, right? So let's say
Yep.
400, you have to have a second entrance unless you have an entrance X feet wide, and understanding that if it is on a state highway, the state has to approve it, that's just part of the parameters. It's like somebody having to have a stoplight or something, right?
But you don't need to have that extra wide entrance like Brett was saying. You have a 3-lane entrance, and then it widens out. The horse park, you have to, a winding road to get back to
Yeah.
registration, and then you get back there by the registration building, and there's slots to
Yeah.
pull off and park there. So, registration building may be closer to the entrance there.
However it needs to say, I don't care, so.
Yeah.
But I think in general, I think we're all saying the 200 number is probably too low.
Yeah.
I think in general, yeah. And that could be an
No,
alternative
no,
solution.
I don't.
Okay.
I think 200's right.
I think a higher is less restrictive, assuming we can still accomplish the same thing with a requirement on the, get in, however you want to say it, not
Size, yeah.
entrance, the size.
So how are we onward? Brett?
There's also the angle that, again, this is open to, an applicant's petition for a variance or a waiver.
Yeah, but that's not so easy when it comes to set in
I
stone with
agree.
emergency traffic.
I agree.
That's a very hard sell. I've heard it many a times.
For safety?
Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
yeah. I think we're best to
Yeah.
write it in.
And what is safety work? Just like talking about another bridge and another mile road.
And I'm not thinking.
If it saves lives, what does it matter?
I think that's why I'm
Part of doing
thinking
business.
it doesn't put lives at risk by doing this, because it's an alternative means of addressing the safety issue.
Yeah,
Because it still allows the
if
traffic.
you narrowed it down, it would be
Yeah.
putting lives at risk.
Exactly. But saying, if you can accomplish this, then it's not, in my mind at least, not putting any additional lives at risk. It's giving an alternative solution. that's less restrictive in terms of the development.
So how we,
So the county's looking for us to amend this RV. Do they have a timeline for it?
I don't believe so.
Why don't Brett and I get with Matt and we'll sit down and try to work out some language, or David too, any of the campers here, and
You saying I can't come because I'm not?
you can come. You don't know which side of the RV the door's on.
You've got to have a camper to get into
Now,
the meeting though.
I have camped before, but I don't actively camp. How about that?
you can bring your
Put you out
bus.
in a tent.
Oh,
Bring your
no
bus.
way, buddy.
We'll get together and talk about this the next couple of weeks there
Okay.
and try to come up with some language.
Okay.
How about that? So do we need to?
Just continue the public hearing to next meeting.
All right, we'll continue the public hearing to the next meeting on the text amendment for the RV camp.
I want to apologize to these guys, you fixed to vote yes, and I stirred the question up.
We had to punish you somehow, Roy.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other business tonight?
Well, we did put on their discussion of the A5 zone.
Oh, we did.
Just
Yeah.
because we talked about it at workshop, and I guess I can review the discussion at workshop. We've had an issue of applicants getting around the intent of the A5 district, and this goes back to the last comprehensive plan update. Well, actually, yeah, the 2011 comprehensive plan update, the Rural Land Use Committee decided that it would be a good idea to create a rural residential zoning category. So any major subdivisions in the county would have to go through a rezoning process rather than be allowed by right and just go to the planning commission. They would have to take that extra step so that we could look at whether there's infrastructure available, are they in areas that, the roads are too narrow, there's not, there's not water pressure for fire protection. So we could look at the infrastructure. So we created this district, and the way it was defined was you need to rezone to A5 for any major subdivision. And we have a definition of major subdivision. Well, let me go back. Any major subdivision of lots between 5 and 10 acres in size, because it was intended, or cluster subdivisions, because it was intended for those residential lots, not big, farm divisions or whatever. So the A5 was defined as any new major subdivision of lots between 5 and 10 acres need to be rezoned, and that's what this category is created for. And our definition of a major, or our definition of a minor, is two residential lots, and the remainder is you can do as a minor. If you do 3 or more, or 4 or more total, 3 or more lots and a remainder is a major. So that's the threshold. So if you're doing a major with lots between 5 and 10 acres, you'd have to rezone to this category. Well, we got into a situation where people were doing, say there's a 200-acre farm, they were doing a minor, two lots in the remainder of the farm, and they'd come back later on and do 2 more lots. And if you just look at it on its own, it meets the definition of minor, doesn't rise to the level of requiring a zone change. So we see multiple minors, on the same parent tract. So we discussed it and we've kind of been talking about amending the text of the zoning. That's one option. We can just amend it and just be clear, you need to rezone if you're doing, if you're re-subdividing a parent tract, just make it clear. Or we could just go back and tell people up front, when you're subdividing off, a farm tract, parent tract, that you're allowed 1 minor. The second time you come back, you're gonna have to rezone that, even though, you may have done 2 lots initially, the second time you do another lot, you would kick yourself over the threshold and you'd have to rezone. The reason we've been reluctant to do that is because then we treat, you know, we've adopted, well, it's going to the legislative bodies this month, but we've got this new fencing requirement. And, you know, we're going to get into a situation where you might have a 5-acre lot that's adjacent to an A1 zone 5-acre lot, and you're going to have to put up this 6-foot high fence and buffer. And that's going to be difficult to do, but I mean, people aren't going to take that very well, but it's what the rule is. And the only reason you'd be doing it is because you circumvented, you know, the system, the requirement. So I just wanted to, we discussed that, and we thought it was best to just inform people up front, you know, you're allowed one minor. After that, you're going to have to rezone. And if you intend to do multiple lots on a farm in the beginning, you'd be better off just rezoning it all and getting all the lots approved up front rather than try to go around the requirement for rezoning. So that was basically the discussion. Just, you know, inform everybody up front what the rule is, and so they can't come back and say, well, we weren't aware of the fact that if we did another lot, it would kick in a rezoning.
So what would be the process to make that happen? What will we have to do to tie that loophole that we can't do that? What would be the process? You have to have a hearing on that, or?
Well, it would be basically just enforcing the letter of the law right now as it is. We wouldn't have to do anything. If we wanted to amend that requirement, if we thought that was unreasonable, unfair, or illogical the way it was written, then we could do a text amendment and rewrite it. But the way that, because we put in the language that A5 is created for any major subdivisions of lots between 5 and 10 acres, it creates a couple of loopholes. One, our definition of major subdivision is odd in my mind, because it's not a subdivision of 20 lots. You know, it's not a large subdivision. You know, you could do 3 residential lots and a remainder, and it's a major, and that's still not a huge subdivision. It's not much different than 2, but it kicks in a whole rezoning process. So we could change that and say, no, for 10 lots or more, you need to go through a rezoning and just raise. But then we'll probably have people come in and do 9, and then come back later and do 9 more. But, so it does that. And then by also saying the A5 is for a major of lots between 5 and 10 acres. If you do, it may encourage or incentivize doing 10-acre and larger lots. And also, you can't, you know, I guess you can't get the ag exemption anymore for 5-acre lots. You have to have at least 10 acres to claim the ag exemption. So you're incentivized to do greater than 10-acre lots anyway. So we may see more 10-acre lots by leaving that language the way it is. So that's another reason that we may want to consider doing a text amendment. But those are the 2 things I see. It incentivizes 10-acre lots to avoid the rezoning process, which may be a good or bad thing. I don't know. Personally, I think it's maybe a bad thing because it's going to eat up more of the, you know, prime farmland with residential lots that are, you know, larger than people want, you know.
And can
I don't
afford.
know, and can afford. But then at the same time, it may encourage people doing cluster subdivisions, you know, when they are going to do a major subdivision, you know, a large subdivision.
This is really about stopping folks from skirting the
Yeah,
regulations.
I mean,
and
that's
enforcing
what it
them.
comes down to, that we've seen a few, you know, applicants who know that what they want to do requires a zone change,
Yeah.
but they want to avoid having to go through, you know, that potential denial at fiscal court, or that, you know, that public hearing for a zone change, which is a higher standard of, you know, they have to provide
Word has
findings
spread.
that it's justified and that there's the infrastructure there. So it's a higher hurdle. So there are some that are knowingly trying, you know, going around it. Yeah. That's the other thing we've talked about. We could just not use the major minor, but just definition within the A5 and just try and regulate, you know,
If
in
I
a
might,
different way.
if the way it's worded now has inherent ambiguity, then I think we need to change the language, period. Just simply changing our interpretation of it is simply going to cause problems and cause opposition. And I think we do need to have that conversation you're just talking about. Are we encouraging smaller or not? Because we don't want to do that. On the other hand, we don't want to require things that nobody can afford either. It just seems like to me we need to have some, you know, serious thought, discussion, public hearing that would be associated with an actual text amendment. It also seems to me we need to drop the major-minor distinction on farm divisions into residential lots, because a major subdivision, that isn't what that is.
Yeah.
And it ought to have just a different category. It ought to have utterly different standards. I mean, just like when people come in and they see something about subdivision, well, technically, yeah, it is one, but that's not what they're afraid of. And we're just getting all kinds of confusion just by the basic concepts in the first place. So it seems like to me we need to get rid of the ambiguity. We probably need to get rid of those words. And we need to figure out where it is that a zone change ought to come in, because that's a major undertaking for somebody who's just cutting out 3 or 4 or 5 acre tracts. I mean, that's kind of absurd. Plus, if we've got a threshold of, let's just say it's 3, and after that you've got to get a zone change, well, what if their overall plan is for 4? We're going to have a zone change for 1 lot, while we already have 3 rural residential that's not a zone change. That's absurd.
Yeah.
We need to stop, and we need to start over.
That is the problem, yeah.
And part of the problem is not necessarily staff or planning ideas. It's because we've had this problem for 30 years, and the fiscal courts refuse to do anything because they want farmers to have that 5 acre option. I understand that. My God, we had that argument in here I don't know how many hundreds of times back before. It's a done deal, it ain't going to happen anyway. So I think we just need to kind of think that through. Times are different now. My gosh, costs are ridiculously different now. And just see what that ought to look like. I mean, just your one example is what really jumped out at me. Well, if we have it 10, they'll just do 9. Can you imagine if they do 9, then realize they need 1 more? Whoops, they got a zone change for that 1, even though they got 9 wrapped all around it. I just think we need to stop and just do it, and do it as one ordinance. And have the public comment, and that way when it's done, we can't say, well, we just changed our interpretation. Because that makes us look high-handed even if we do a great job. And we don't need that.
It's a good point.
I agree. We also need supper.
Also, that's also a good point.
In no particular order.
Well, do you all agree with that? Have us look at the language in the A5 district?
I think so.
Okay,
And remove the ambiguity.
okay.
Once and for all.
Or put some new in, we'll have something else to deal with.
Yeah.
All right.
What's the possibility of having a restriction on a deed or something that they can't divide after 2 or 3?
Well, I mean, we could look at a time restriction that you could only do, 1 or 2 every 5 years or some time period. If we allow 5 acre lots, I don't know if we can, we'd have to change that part of it to not allow them at all.
Sounds like May County.
There'd have to be some process they'd have to go through, but if 5 acre lots are what the standard are for A1 or A5, I think we'd have to allow the opportunity to subdivide into 5 acre lots. That's all. That's all I have.
You got your marching orders.
Yep. I got 'em.
I think it's
You
a,
can
I
have
think
that
it's a
next week,
great
right?
thing though you're
Oh,
fixing.
Yeah.
It's gonna be
Oh, good for you.
It needs to be addressed, I think.
I have wondered, it's so easy.
Tell them to take care of it while you're gone.
Anymore, you just go in and do that, and you do another three. Yeah, of course, it's a problem. I see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So does, commission have any questions for staff or additional comments?